We have a few minutes for questions before we break for informal conversation. So Ted and Marty, do you want to field some questions for Tim?
Okay, great.
Okay, please.
I'll let you stand up, Ted, and then let's see what comes up.
I'd like a little bit more discussion from the two of you, possibly on the possibly measurable differences or program to distinguish theistic evolution from atheistic evolution. And it just struck me that maybe Professor Towns' suggestion, maybe there's a scientific way, maybe there is a way of distinguishing the two. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on how do you distinguish theistic from atheistic evolution.
I would think the comprehensive scheme, our method, correct me if I'm wrong, is to really start with a theological scheme and ask about the interaction with this particular domain of science in light of a theological vision. We do not want to found our theological vision on what we learn about nature from evolutionary biology. The atheistic agenda, at least the one in the late 19th century, also started with a materialist scheme, but they felt that natural selection, because it appealed only to natural causes, really could provide the scientific foundation for a materialism. And so I'm thinking on my feet that maybe we rely less on the foundational task of this kind of science than perhaps an atheist would. What do you think?
Dr. Towns was maybe mentioning or bringing up that maybe there was a measurable way to distinguish. I'm not sure, but
I thought his point had to deal with discernible purpose or not.
Well, let me perhaps attempt an answer and see if it leads us to where Dr. Towns was going. I would say that the distinction here is not with the word evolution, but with the adjective that we've applied. So evolution, in this case specifically biological evolution, would be a scientific description, model, set of observations, paradigm, however you wish to couch that is independent of the adjective in this case. I would argue that the adjective describes the response to the science. On the one hand, as theistic evolutionists, our response to the science is to accept it as the best science, but keep that science in perspective in terms of its task. I would argue that the atheistic response to the science is to let the science then become a philosophical position, or at least generate a philosophical position that then has a further explanatory point with regard to nature. So we would not extend the evolutionary model into trying to make proof of theological points. We would rather let the theology reflect back on that scientific position in the ways we've described. A Richard Dawkins position might represent the atheistic evolution position, in which the science actually drives him into a philosophical discussion itself. Now, I'm not sure if that gets at this issue of whether Dr. Towns' position could actually provide us a distinction between those two. What I was hearing is that in our current scientific model, in our method, we sort of agreed not to consider purpose. We don't use teleology as one of them. In fact, we eliminated that in formal cause. We only operate with material and efficient cause now. Having made that decision, then, it's almost by definition that you can't see purpose. If purpose is not part of your experimental protocol, how could you ever observe it? It becomes a problem with the life sciences, because we see things behaving in living systems with purpose. So it's a question of whether we want to insert that back into the protocol. And that's really the argument that Bill Dembski has. At its heart, Bill's philosophical truck with science is we need to put the teleology back in where it belongs. And that's an argument for the philosophy of science, not really for the methodology of science. As science is constructed now, Charlie, I would argue we can't see purpose because we chose not to look for it. I'm gonna say it that way. Even though it might be there, as you said, it might be that it's there. When I go into the laboratory to work with viruses, I can't find purpose because I've chosen a method that, by definition, doesn't include purpose as a goal. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay.
You see in your model compatibility from the theological, Christological, and Trinitarian perspective to include that as evidence of design, or in the primary clause element, or in the secondary clause? How do you are able to accommodate the doctrinal aspect into the theistic model?
Why don't you go first?
How do we incorporate observable design into the model?
No, Trinitarian thought. How does Trinitarian thought fit into our model?
Because you are separating the first clause and second clause. So let's say would you have been inclusive, wanted to have a Trinitarian perspective, accommodating both clauses.
Well, we're constructing a building, and we're still down around the first floor here. And let me just say that's a good question. I don't really have a good answer for that.
Let me just take a stab. Just the theology I'm going to use is rubbed off from Ted here in a large sense. But Antonio, I might argue that Ted's use of theology of the cross and resurrection in fact incorporates a Trinitarian view that's going to reflect back on evolution in much the same way that Jack Hout does in his writing, by saying that the incarnation, the cross and resurrection imply for a Christian who's a Trinitarian that God shares in the imperfection of nature, in the evolutionary process with us, by having become part of it in the person of Christ. So there is a Trinitarian take in Jack's work, and certainly in the work we've done, that incorporates that implicitly, I'd say. It's not stated there, but that's sort of the implicit argument.
Let me just add to that. There are some in this discussion who really want to ask the question as to whether or not Jesus represents an evolutionary advance of some kind. We have not pushed that particular question. Be that as it may, one would have to make a commitment about God's presence in finite time and space. The other important thing has to do with the Holy Spirit, which is that which binds things together. And certainly Teilhard really developed the notion of God's Spirit in an extremely full way. We just haven't gotten to the point of asking how that would relate to what we observe in biological evolution.
I have a question about the use of the term. I'm prompted to raise this partly by having read one of the excellent papers that will be presented tomorrow by Ante Jacqueline challenging your use of theistic evolution. Tonight you said that you've used it, you've adopted it partly because that's what the other side was calling you. Now, if that were not the case, would you have chosen this term, or would you think of something else to call it?
That's a good question. Anya's paper has really set me to thinking about this. I think the answer is no. I think we would have selected a different term. I don't know what that term would have been, but we didn't really select it because it represents our position as much as it seemed to be a convenience within a controversy already, within which the parameters are already set by the creationists and the intelligent design people. I hope we'll have a rich discussion tomorrow, and I think that in part this may reflect the American battle, cultural battle, And if we didn't have that as our context, we might have selected a better term for this.
And I think tomorrow, I'm really looking forward to Ansh's paper, because in reading what you wrote, I think you're pushing us beyond that battle, which is what I liked about it. You want us to move away from just defining ourselves by that conflict and moving into a richer kind of arena. So I'm looking forward to that discussion tomorrow also.
In the very early days of the use of the word intelligent design, as I remember, it was used by scientists, for example, the idea that intelligent design meant that somehow the laws of science were designed in such a way that there could be evolution and we could develop and all these very good things could happen. And what puzzles me is the fundamentalists attached to intelligent design somehow brush aside that idea, that kind of definition of intelligent design completely, I gather. That evolution is a part of intelligent design, maybe. And I just can't understand their philosophy.
Were you alluding to a position that would say the initial conditions at the beginning of the universe were such that over a period of time intelligent life could develop? Is that what intelligent design refers to?
The laws of science were constructed in such a way that intelligent life could develop, and by evolution.
Right.
So evolution was part of the design, you see. And that was the early use of the word, as I remember.
Well, there's an
Early use of the
ambiguity.
word, and now it's completely changed.
Right. There's an ambiguity in the work of Michael Behe which could actually fit that. For example, Michael Behe raises the question as to whether or not the designer needs to be an interventionist or not. It seems to me that the intelligent design position, to be coherent, has to have an intelligent designer who intervenes at certain stages of evolutionary development in order to get it past a threshold of some kind or another. Behe considers this and he says, well, the designer doesn't have to be an interventionist. The designer could have put it way back at the beginning in seed form, and now it's coming to blossom later. And it would. So the first thing is, there's something of what you're talking about there in Behe. But secondly, I find that one incoherent because it seems to me a scientist could find a seed as well as a blossom if it were there, you know.
And Bill Dembski is another example of this, that in his writing, he wants to make the designer an interventionist, as Bob would say, an intervening designer that gets over the, as he calls it, a specified complexity barrier. But in discussion at meetings or in private sort of conversations after his papers, if you push, he's willing to let that be a part of the laws that are set up. I mean, he really is willing to be pushed back to that point, which again, as Ted said, is contradictory with what he writes and contradictory with the presentations he makes. So it wants to hark back to, as you said, the idea that the design is inherent in the, as Bill Steger calls it, the law-like behavior of the universe. Why is there this law-like behavior? Right.
I have a suggestion about linking the creation and the creation and eschatology. There are a lot of resources, especially in biblical theology and in cultural anthropology, that make a strong link between the creative moment and the eschatological moment, which I think can be developed a lot, particularly in terms of the analogical work that you have to do in order to properly understand primary causality in a less than adequate way. And that is that in some sense, creation is a relationship that the origin is always active in nature and driving things towards fulfillment. Right? It's not back there. It's always present. And so a number of French biblical scholars in particular have pointed out the fact that in the richest creation literature in the Old Testament, for instance, you have this notion that there is an eschatological moment to creation that's already built in.
I'm not quite getting the connection between the origin being present and the eschatological moment. Can you say a bit more about that?
Well, it's just that any action that is following from creation has a natural that the origin continues to be active, imminently active in the creation.
Would everything that will be actualized eschatologically have already been present as a potential at the beginning, do you think?
I don't know whether you could put it that way, but I think you could at least...
Okay, you're not saying that.
I'm not saying that.
Okay, good. Okay, thank you.
Well, Ted, in fact, one of the pieces of what we've done that you wrote that I love is the idea of God releasing us from the determinism of the past by opening up the future at every moment. And that in some sense expresses, I think, maybe what you're saying, but we need these resources to support that notion of constantly opening up our future in a creative and a continuing way.
Yeah. For us, eschatology isn't just the distant future. It's really God's action every moment that releases us from the grip of the past, opening up the possibility for secondary causation to have its temporal impact, while at the same time holding out for the whole of the world its fulfillment, its consummate fulfillment. So eschatology is a dynamic that is as close to us as the next moment is. It's not in calendar time, years down the line.
I think my point would be in that language is that creation is the same thing.
Yes.
I mean, creation is also dynamic in the same way.
That's right.
We have time for one last question.
I just wanted to, something that came up in a discussion today in class about the lion and the lamb and the eschatology of that. This idea of their kind of the preference for the prey over the predator. But you said Luther said that lamb would be eaten. So it sounds like that there's an openness in that you're thinking that in our eschatology we would have the predator and the prey. I mean, an embracing of that predator-prey relationship and not reversing it so that the lion is laying down with the lamb. I know these are all just analogies, but that's coming up a lot in conversations.
They are loose analogies, and Luther, even though Luther had a sense of humor, and I think he was trying to say, this is really a tough nut to crack. The image of a lion lying down with a lamb. And the description of all of life requiring a predator-prey relationship. I mean, it's everywhere, 24 hours a day. I mean, you never get away from it. That is the nature of biology. So to make a movement in the theology of the cross to say, God has a special place in the divine heart for the victims of the predator-prey, all right? Can we learn that from the cross and talk about the natural world? We're asking that question. Then on the resurrection side, or the promise of new creation, given that the book of Genesis tells us God wants to declare all of this very good, what does that mean? And so images such as the lion lying down with the lamb, or in the New Jerusalem, the book of Revelation, there will be healing so that there'll be no more tears anymore. I mean, that's about the best we can do. We had a conference a couple years ago at Heidelberg with some of our German colleagues on the question of how could we imagine a resurrected body that which is there in Christian symbolism, in light of what we know about biology, you know, it was really hard, really hard. So the best we can do is a romantic metaphor such as lions lying down with lambs, because there isn't a way in which we can conceive of bodies as we know it that aren't involved in predator-prey relationships of some kind. Yet, theologically, that's what we got to deal with, you know. So,
Okay, let's give a warm round of applause for Ted and Marty. Oh.